Hello, and welcome to the Humanistic Counselor, a podcast in which we discuss, analyze, critique, and celebrate both well-established and cutting-edge ideas across the field of humanistic counseling. I'm Brett Wilkinson, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, otherwise known as JHC. I'd like to welcome Dr. Nathaniel Ivers and Dr. David Johnson. Dr. Ivers is Professor and Chair of the Department of Counseling at Wake Forest University. He is a National Certified Counselor with professional counseling licenses in North Carolina and Texas. He has worked extensively with Latine immigrant populations as a bilingual counselor, alcohol counselor, private practitioner, and independent contractor, providing services to individuals, couples, and families. His research focuses on multicultural counseling competence, counseling Latine individuals, existentialism, mindfulness, and bilingualism. Dr. Ivers, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Dr. David Johnson is Associate Professor and Associate Chair of the Department of Counseling at Wake Forest University. He's a licensed professional counselor and board-approved supervisor in Texas. He has worked extensively with children and adolescents who've experienced complex trauma and neglect, as well as adults, couples, and families in various community-based settings. His research includes the use of mindfulness and meditation practices to foster relational skills and multicultural competencies, as well as assessment and measurement issues related to in-session experiences of mindfulness and empathy. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So in today's interview, we'll discuss their 2022 JHC research article, The Relationship Between Mindfulness and Multicultural Counseling Competence Among Mental Health Practitioners. So to begin, why don't we define some terms as they relate to your body of work? What do you all mean by mindfulness, and what do you mean by multicultural competence?
Yeah, well, I'll start by sharing kind of our operational definition that we have for mindfulness. So, when we think of mindfulness, we see it as part of the eightfold path coming from the Buddhist teachings, and it's definitely gained attention in Western social sciences. But in terms of our specific research, we really think of mindfulness as this mode of attention in which a person is intentionally focused their attention on present moment experiences while adopting and accepting a non-judgmental attitude towards those experiences. And so if we take that general definition, it's probably familiar to many counselors. We can break that down to two general components: the idea of present moment awareness, and sometimes we hear that as bare attention, here and now attention. Sometimes it's likened to Husserl's notion of the phenomenological attitude. And the second component is this idea of acceptance and non-judgment, that you're curious and accepting of whatever those present moment awareness experiences happen to be. And I always like to point out that when we talk about acceptance in this context, it's more akin to acknowledgement than the idea of wanting or hoping for. So we may have an experience that we would never wish for, yet we may be better off if we can accept that it is what is. Sometimes intention is included as maybe a third component of mindfulness with some of the Western social sciences. Sometimes intention is kind of grouped with, it's an intention to be presently focused. I don't get too hung up on which one of those two is relevant. However, I do think the concept of having intention in there will have implications for when we are trying to train counseling students and working with them. And so that's kind of the general operational definition that we usually take. But there are, I think, three important distinctions that we do focus on with how that term mindfulness is generally used in the counseling literature, because sometimes these distinctions are not clarified and they do have implications for I think counseling, for counselor training, and that sort of thing. And so the first distinction I think is important to note is almost like a state trait distinction. When we're talking about mindfulness, when we're talking about a mode of paying attention, that is going to be temporally and contextually specific. Someone will start paying attention in a mindful manner at one point in time in a certain circumstance, and at some other point in time, they will no longer be engaged in that way of paying attention. And so in that way, we can almost think of mindfulness as more of a state as opposed to a disposition or trait. However, at the same time, individuals seem to differ in their general tendency to engage in that mindful way of paying attention across contexts and situations. And so we can also think of mindfulness as a trait or a disposition of an individual, in that they may be more or less likely to engage in that mindfulness in different settings. And that distinction, I think, is really important, because a lot of our assessment instruments for mindfulness capture mindfulness or conceptualize it more as a trait, a general tendency. But I think a lot of times when we are thinking about training counselors, we do have specific attention we want to pay to, well, what are you doing in session with your client, which is going to be temporally and contextually specific. And so I think that's one important distinction. Another important distinction is noticing the distinction between mindfulness as a mental or construct, whether state or trait, and mindfulness or meditation practices. Like sometimes those two are conflated in the literature and maybe not clear. And I think it's important to note the distinction between those, because knowing that a general tendency is related to something is helpful and informative. However, that may not have as many implications for working with counselor trainees, unless we start to look at that. What are those practices that we may be able to recommend or engage in or help them to foster to increase that capacity to be mindfully present, which then we may have to help them cultivate to engage in that during a specific session. So when I'm working with counseling students about trying to cultivate that in-session mindful awareness, I kind of use an analogy of almost like exercise to point out these three distinctions, where if we think, we all have a general capacity for strength. We all have, some amount, and some have more than others, but, we have a capacity, and that capacity for strength, maybe whatever your, 1 rep max for a bench press might be, that's there, but that doesn't necessarily tell us at any given moment how much energy you're exerting on something, you know. And we can take that and even make that distinction from activities that one might engage in to increase that capacity for strength. And so the way we might think of strength, your capacity for strength at 1 rep max, versus how much energy you're exerting at any specific time, and then maybe push-ups or bench presses or any other exercises could be analogous to trait mindfulness, state mindfulness, and meditation practices.
Fantastic. Dr. Ivers, how about on the other side with the multicultural competence?
Yeah, so a lot of my research has been on trying to identify um, variables that are related to multicultural counseling competence, and to break it down into simplistic terms. And it's a fairly complex construct, and it's also dynamic. It's, I think, ever changing, evolving, and we're learning more about what it really means over time. But if I'm thinking about what multicultural counseling competence is practically, it's our ability to work with individuals whose cultural worldviews, identities, attitudes, and backgrounds differ from our own. And that will, I mean, in some instances there might be minor differences. In other instances, there may be, categorical differences between the counselor and the client in regard to how we see the world, in the ways in which we grew up, in our values, our beliefs, our behaviors, in our dispositions. And how do we as counselors recognize those differences without being overly reactive to them? And how do we modify our work to be beneficial to individuals based on their cultural makeup? So Sue and Associates back in '82 came up with a tripartite model of multicultural competence called the cross-cultural model of MCC. But it was they essentially broke it down into three things: cultural attitudes and beliefs, cultural knowledge, and cultural skills. Later, it was modified, and they really emphasized multicultural awareness, knowledge, and skills. And in a lot of our research, we've focused on the knowledge and the awareness piece, and hoping that the knowledge and awareness ultimately influences the actual skills that we engage with folks. So when we're talking about knowledge, we're discussing our ability to understand our own culture. And because culture is considered ubiquitous, we're born into culture. Sometimes we don't even recognize the differences that might exist between ourselves and other individuals who grew up differently than ourselves. And so some of the work that we want to do as counselors is to recognize our own cultural beliefs, attitudes, values, etc. Not just the surface level ones, which are our traditional foods and the clothing that we wear and the traditional holidays that we celebrate and things like that, but also some of those deeper undercurrents that really influence life, such as individualism and collectivism, locus of control, time orientation, proxemics can have and can have an influence on us as well, like how comfortable we are with personal space and things like that. But understanding our own culture is an important piece, but also understanding differences between our cultures and other cultures without being sort of narrow-minded or fixed in that regard and stereotyping individuals. So that's the knowledge piece. The awareness piece is really about recognizing our own biases, our own beliefs, our attitudes, the prejudices we might have related to culture. In some instances, it might be ethnocentrism. I know there are differences between my cultures and others, but I really believe that mine is right. It could also just be tied to sort of a knee-jerk reaction where that didn't feel right, but it's nothing specific about them. I just can't quite understand what seems to be wrong there. And so it might be below our conscious understanding, which would be implicit bias, or it could be within our understanding, which is explicit in nature. So a lot of the ways in which we have measured multicultural competence has been with self-report, which is more of an explicit bias for multicultural awareness. But we've also done some work on implicit bias as well. So self-report MCC instruments may measure one's actual effectiveness in working with others, and it may actually measure their self-efficacy or their beliefs about their abilities to work with people who have different cultural values in their own. So that's in a nutshell a little bit about cultural competence. I know there's a lot more, but I think that's a good starting point.
And you two have laid out and identified general points, but it shows and demonstrates the complexity of these concepts. And then the intersection of these concepts, the intersection of mindfulness and multicultural competence is even more dynamic. Can you tell us what your research has uncovered about the relationship between mindfulness and cultural awareness and even bias?
I can start with our seminal article. We wrote a paper together as well as with some other authors in 2016 that looked at the relationship between dispositional mindfulness and multicultural counseling competence, self-report multicultural counseling competence. And the participants in that study were counseling students. They were master's and doctoral level students at various universities, but had not yet graduated from their master's or PhD program. And most of them were master's level folks. And what we found was that we used the 5-facet mindfulness instrument, and we found that non-reactivity to inner experience was positively related to multicultural awareness, and that mindfulness describing was positively related to multicultural knowledge. And essentially, our hypothesis related to this, because it was an exploratory study, was that one's ability to be non-reactive to experiences related to culture likely help them improve their ability to recognize their biases and their prejudices and hopefully work through those. One's ability to be more descriptive, aware of their inner and sort of the external stimuli that were occurring may have given them a leg up in their ability to not engage in ethnocentrism or other types of defense mechanisms that would keep them from being open to cultural concepts. And so that openness, we believe, may have contributed to their ability to understand themselves as cultural beings as well as others in different ways. And that sort of began our process. And I'll let Dr. Johnson talk a little bit about kind of where we went from there. Oh, you're muted.
Okay. So the next study that we looked at was an attempt to kind of move beyond our original work and just expand that or the body of knowledge. And so we wanted to try to see if we could move beyond some of the limitations of the self-report multicultural competence instruments. And so, as Nate was explaining earlier, sometimes those instruments may capture more of explicit or conscious biases that we have, but may not tap into unconscious biases that could affect our behaviors or how we approach our work with clients or understand them. Also, the self-report instruments are going to kind of have sometimes a conflation between what I can do and what I think I can do. That can be kind of a limitation of those types of instruments. We also wanted to not only look at that trait or dispositional mindfulness, but kind of think about those behaviors related to these. And so thinking about specifically engagement in meditation practices. So we wanted to see, are there variations with these cultural concepts that are related to what counselors are actually doing. And finally, we wanted to kind of expand the populations we were looking at. Our original study was looking at counselors in training. There was another study similar to ours that was published by Campbell and colleagues shortly after our first article that did look at meditation practices and multicultural competencies. However, they also were looking at counselors in training. So we wanted to see, okay, well, is what we're finding generalizable to, practicing mental health practitioners, regardless of their discipline and regardless of their, licensure status. And so what we did is we looked at the four-race implicit association test as a measure, in addition to self-report measures of multicultural competence. We assessed dispositional mindfulness, again, using the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. But we also asked participants about their frequency of engaging in meditation practices. How many times a week are you engaging in these practices? And so we wanted to examine these different components to see, when we accounted for demographic characteristics, when we accounted for multicultural competencies, were there any facets of trait mindfulness then associated with implicit bias associated with race? And the 4-race IAT quantifies implicit bias associated with favoring or disfavoring individuals who are white, Black, Hispanic, or Asian. And so what we found was that of those 4 measures in the 4-race IAT, the only one that was associated with anything was, favoring whites over other ethnic groups, which we thought would make a lot of sense, given that our sample was primarily white. Here in the U.S., that would be probably the more predominant bias that we might see. So what we ultimately found in our study was that the observing component of the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, which is essentially that measure of present moment awareness that piece of mindfulness, had
Mm-hmm.
a negative association with having a bias favoring white people over people of other ethnic categories. And then when we looked at the frequency of engaging in meditation practices, what we found was that the more frequent engagement in meditation practices amongst mental health professionals had a negative association with that implicit bias favoring white people over other ethnic minorities.
So the implicit bias was lower when people engaged in more mindfulness practices.
exactly. And so, we thought this was pretty consistent with what prior studies had shown, these, benefits of engaging in meditation, that mindfulness was associated with um, decreased bias or less bias. And so that, we felt like that was a good addition to our study. Obviously, more research is needed in that area. But then that was what led us to the 2022 paper that was
Mm-hmm.
published in JHC. I'm going to let Nate begin that conversation.
Well, first of all, I don't think there are enough replication studies out there. I won't go on a soapbox with that, but a lot of the seminal psychological studies that we read about and that we hold up as kind of beacons have not been replicated. Or if there were attempts to replicate them, they found different results. And so we were wondering that for our own study for the 2016 one is this a snapshot? Could it be related to some sort of limitation of our study? Or is there truly a relationship between mindfulness and multicultural competence that should be explored further? But we didn't want to replicate it one to one. We didn't want to do it with counseling students, and we wanted to use slightly different instruments to seek sort of what came out. So rather than using the full version of the 5-facet mindfulness inventory, we used a briefer version of that. It still had the same constructs and the same variables, but slightly different items and fewer of them. And we also, as David shared, we decided to see if there was a relationship between these constructs with actual practitioners, and it wasn't just related to students who were seeing this from a textbook perspective, but not necessarily in actual application. So we ran essentially the same study, just with those differences. It took longer because we had to recruit actual practitioners, and that's not always easy to do. It was a convenient sample. It would have been absolutely wonderful and great if we could have done a randomized or just have like a simple random sampling, but we couldn't get a listserv of emails and use every nth one. So it was convenient sampling. And that's the potential limitation. So those who decided to participate in our study self-selected. But anyway, that being said, we did some preliminary analyses to see what facets of mindfulness would be related to awareness and knowledge. And based on those results, we ran a regression analysis to control for different variables. It's a hierarchical linear regression. And not to get into the weeds too deeply, we found that certain facets of mindfulness were related to awareness and knowledge, and some were not, and they weren't exactly the same ones as we had found from our 2016 study, or exactly what Campbell had found either in their 2018 study. So for knowledge in particular, we actually, I'm going to talk specifically about awareness. Awareness was sort of our
Okay.
weird one here.
Yeah.
Um, for awareness, we found that mindfulness observe and non-judgment were positively related to not espousing a Eurocentric white bias. And so the multicultural counseling knowledge and awareness scale really looks at awareness in relation to how much are you fixated on a Eurocentric bias versus being more open to different ways of showing up and presenting yourself in sessions. So questions like, do you believe all clients should be giving you direct eye contact? Would be a type of question they would ask. Do you believe everybody should be fostering independence? rather than interdependence, those types of questions. And so if you were, I think everybody should, you would be low in multicultural awareness. If you say absolutely not, then you would be high in multicultural awareness. So in terms of observe and non-judgment, we found that there was a positive correlation. The effect size was larger with observe than it was with non-judge, but there was definitely that positive relationship. There was actually a negative relationship, however, in reference to, let's see, it was acting with awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one other. What do you remember? What it was, Dave?
Yeah, it's the non-reacting to inner
Non-reactivity to inner
experiences.
experience. That's right. Yeah. So we actually found an inverse relationship there. So individuals higher in awareness were lower in those particular facets of mindfulness, and vice versa. Although if you looked at the raw data, we actually had a fairly truncated range where nobody was really espousing a Eurocentric worldview. It was basically from 1 to 7. It was between like a 4 and a 7
Gotcha.
on those. So we had to try to figure out what that meant. And I'm going to let David kind of take a stab at that particular piece, but we found that to be interesting.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of an example where I think the devils are in the details, and we start really thinking about what exactly are these instruments measuring here. And when we look at that 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, it's a very common instrument used in mindfulness research and counseling. However, Coffey and colleagues had done a study in, I think it was 2010, where they tried to really get at those specific components of the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. And, short, answer of kind of what they found that observing component really seemed to capture that present moment awareness, and the non-judging component really captured that accepting orientation to present moment experience. So when we think of that sort of 2-component definition of mindfulness that we started with, it's really those facets of observing and non-judging that capture mindfulness itself. The
Okay.
other 3 scales of the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire are describing, the capacity to describe your inner experience, not reacting to what that inner experience is, and then acting with awareness based on that experience. And so what Coffey had pointed out is that it really seems like the observing and non-judging scales capture mindfulness. And these other 3 scales are really things we can do as a function of being mindful.
Implications of being mindful.
Exactly. And again, if we go back to that, this is a trait or dispositional measure, they're not making those clear distinctions, or it could be very easy to not notice them. And so when we looked back at those results for the multicultural counselor awareness, what we found is those 2 facets that really conceptualize mindfulness itself had that positive association with that multicultural awareness, which again was that perspectives on those Eurocentric worldviews. In our sample, what we saw was, we had mid-range to high scores representing those that didn't have a stance or were somewhat moderate to those who were very much opposed to a Eurocentric worldview. Whereas those facets of mindfulness that are a result of being mindful, non-reacting, the acting with awareness, had the negative association with that. So the way we interpreted this, and I think we still have conversations going back about, are we missing something here? Is that our thought was like, if you have a counselor who's very mindful and very multiculturally competent and very aware, what we might expect them to see is that if they're highly mindful and aware of their stances or perspectives on a Eurocentric worldview, we'd expect those to see high scores across the board on observing, non-judging, multicultural awareness. We'd also expect that someone who's very mindful to not necessarily respond to whatever those beliefs might be. So the way we're interpreting this is that someone who is, very mindful when it comes to their views of a Eurocentric worldview, are very aware of what their beliefs are. They're also less likely to then have to act on those beliefs. And so that was our interpretation of the results that we looked at. And again, I think Nate and I still kind of revisit this every now and then. I'm like, okay, are we missing anything here? But I think that would be pretty consistent with what we're seeing in the data, and I think also consistent with the way we're thinking of multicultural counseling and mindfulness itself. That we want counselors to be aware of where their biases are, but then also have that space to not necessarily let those biases, those worldviews that they have and recognize, be what dictates then how they move forward and act when they're engaged with someone else.
On the last note here, Dr. Ivers, do you see any additional implications that you would like listeners, counselor educators, supervisors, et cetera, to take away in terms of how this research, this body of research, can improve counselor training and practice?
Well, one of the reasons we were looking for correlates of multicultural counseling competence, and mindfulness has been a really important one, but it's not the only thing we've looked at, was to try to provide some practical implications to this process. We believe, and I think a lot of people would agree with us, that people don't necessarily go into counseling with the attitude that they only want to work with a certain type of individual. We don't believe that most people want to be monocultural or ethnocentric. We believe that most individuals want to be effective in working with a lot of different individuals. But we also believe that we're not necessarily that effective at doing that. The research is, I think, pretty evident in that in terms of access to counseling services and even retention rates for individuals who are less represented in our communities and our population. So, what can we as counselors, as a profession, and counselors individually do to improve our ability to work with individuals who may differ from us culturally? And we think mindfulness is a really important piece of this. Yeah, there are lots of other things we can do in terms of workshops and learning about our own culture and immersion experiences. But having these dispositions that are tied to a present focus that's accepting, we believe may help us improve our abilities to become culturally responsive and culturally competent in our work. So one thing it might do is being mindful may allow us to be better at bracketing our prejudices and our biases. We're probably not going to ever completely eliminate them as much as we want to work on them, but we do need to be able to bracket them. And I think mindfulness and acceptance helps us do that, whereas recognizing our biases and overreacting to them probably leads to defensiveness and a negative reaction to these types of things. I think it could be employed in multicultural courses where you know there's some variables we have to consider in terms of comfort level with mindfulness and how we employ it with different populations. But doing some sort of mindfulness training before class may open people up to being more receptive to their own biases and behaviors and to cultural differences. In practice, although this particular article showed an inverse relationship between frequency of mindfulness practices and awareness, somewhat based on the same explanation that David shared, we believe that the more frequently you engage in mindfulness meditation, the more likely you would be in a state of mindfulness during different periods of your life, especially in session with clients. And so is engaging in those activities as a practitioner between sessions and then just part of your daily life may improve your openness and may improve your ability to work with people who differ from you.
Okay. I want to thank you both for sharing the richness of this body of work and for everything you've contributed in the field, counselor education and humanism in particular, around this. I think it's not just fascinating work, but the implications are very, very important and powerful, and something that perhaps more dialogue and more replication studies need to be done on. So as a final question I ask everyone, what do you think is valuable about humanistic counseling? Kind of as a snippet. Dr. Johnson, would you start with that? What do you think is valuable?
Yeah, to me, the most valuable thing about humanistic counseling is it really centers the importance of our experience. really takes the primacy. And I think when we think about our clients, all of our models, all of our other explanations all have to come down to, is this consistent with how the client sees and experiences themselves in the world? And that's where we start. I think that's important for our work with clients. I think that has implications for how we train our students and for how we even try to understand ourselves in relations to clients and students and so forth.
Dr. Ivers?
I think it keeps us humble. I think one of the important pieces of humanistic counseling is a recognition that we're greater than the sum of our parts. And that means that we're greater than our genetic makeup. We're greater than the behavioral experiences that we've had that have conditioned certain responses. We're greater than our thoughts and our emotions. And I think as counselors, I don't think necessarily awful for us to have paradigms related to behaviorism or cognitive therapy, or even to recognize the biological components that influence people's lives, but also to acknowledge that there's more to someone than that. So I think it helps us recognize the human condition more acutely and diversely. I think it allows us to stop and then just be with people and understand them in a way that we wouldn't if we're just stuck on our paradigms. I think it also helps us to recognize human potential. A lot of the original theories were like depth psychology. Let's understand the inner depths and challenges that someone faces. But one of the ways in which Frankl's work is described as height psychology. Let's understand the human condition and the potential of human beings as well. And I think humanism helps us foster that.
I agree wholeheartedly. Dr. Nathaniel Ivers, Dr. David Johnson, thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And many thanks to you, good listeners, for spending time with us here at the Humanistic Counselor Podcast. All JHC articles can be accessed through the Wiley Online Library. If you're a member of the Association for Humanistic Counseling, then you get free access to this article and many, many others through the American Counseling Association website at www.counseling.org. If you'd like to become a member of AHC, then we hope you'll visit our website at www.humanisticcounseling.org. Thank you, be well, and hope to see you here next time on the Humanistic Counselor Podcast.